Hi, good morning, everyone. Just welcome to our personal branding GolfRSA sponsored webinar this morning. If I could ask a couple of things just for housekeeping. First and foremost, can we switch on our cameras? It's always so much easier and better for the facilitator if we can see faces. So if I can ask everybody to switch on your cameras, that would be absolutely amazing. Second thing is I've posted the registration link in the chat box. If I can ask every single person in front of a screen, even if there is more than one person in front of a screen, to complete the registration form so that we can acknowledge that you've attended this webinar. Otherwise, we will not be able to send you a certificate of attendance. So please, if everybody can please fill in that registration form. And then, as always, it's a great pleasure to welcome Rob Arnold from RCA Consult. He is going to tackle personal branding for us. Rob has done lots with CMASA over the years, and it's always a pleasure listening to Rob. Welcome, Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. It's great to be back with everyone again. Some of you I saw at the recent managers meetings around the country. And for some, it's the first time this year. So welcome to everyone. As Charles politely requested, and I'll echo that, if you can put on your camera, fantastic. This is meant to be quite an interactive webinar. So I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind me being able to see your face and just see the glee on your face when I do mention your name and ask you to present yourself in front of everyone, which we all love to do, particularly Pierre, who enjoys a bit of public speaking in his spare time. Cassie as well, probably an ardent member of Toastmasters, I'm sure. So, ladies and gents, we're gonna get cracking this morning. And as I said, this is very much an interactive webinar. The interesting thing about a personal brand is that it is so subjective, and that with that in mind is what you take out of today is in that sense very subjective as to how you move things forward. Both for yourself, but ultimately this value is also for the team that you manage and lead on a day-to-day basis. So see it in those two capacities. I must, just before we get going, thank GolfRSA for their kind sponsorship of these webinars. These aren't possible without them. So thank you to the great team, Grant and the rest of the guys who obviously make these happen. I want to kick off this morning with an interesting quote, and the individual who shared this with me chose to remain anonymous, speaks to his character. But something that I want to share with you to kick things off this morning is that members and visitors don't connect with a club; they connect with the personalities that represent the club. And I think if you go back to your context and you go back into your environment, you know, a large part of the reason why people choose to reinstate their membership, a large reason why people love the club, fall in love with the space, is not because of the bricks and mortar. It's actually because of the human beings and the personalities that make up that space. And that for that reason, this topic is so important. Our ability to foster personal brands in our clubs is one of the main reasons why we create longevity in our clubs. And I want to reiterate that, ladies and gents. Our ability to create a sustainable club is largely not just because of the infrastructure and the projects we finish, but it's our ability to create the personal brands in our space that ultimately create that stickiness and that value. And with that in mind, I want you to think about the difference between the assets that live in your space. Sorry, can I just ask you to mute yourself? Charles, if you don't mind, I think you're the host. If you don't mind just muting everyone there. You've got to remember the fact that there's two forms of assets that really comprise your club, and that's the infrastructural assets, the tangible things that are there, and then there's the human assets, the individuals that make up the value proposition of your space. And I'm not just talking about your management level, I'm talking about the people at the coal face of the experience, those human beings who answer your phones, those people that are the first port of call, even your security guard who might be an outsourced entity. That individual is a representation of the value of your environment, and that is a personal brand in itself. So we're going to try and touch on as many of these things today as we can and try to understand what personal branding, what the role it plays in that. My first question rhetorically to all of you is, and something to think about, is why do you think certain staff in your environment create what we call more emotional equity with your members and visitors than others? Why do some of those individuals create a dynamic with the people that you call your members and visitors more so than others. And one of the things in our research over the last 14 years, not just in the golf and club industry, but broader than that, is an answer to this question that I find quite interesting. And looking at individuals in different clubs, some of the individuals I'm referring to are in the clubs of people that are on this call this morning. But the answer is this, and that is that they are much more in touch with their personal brand than those who are unable to connect with with your members and visitors. So those people that are moving the needle in the right direction for you, those people who are additive to your club, those are individuals who are actually understanding what their personal brand is all about. Whether that's intentional or not is another question, but the fact is that they're in touch with their identity, what makes them who they are. And what today is really about is how do you get more people in your environment to actually get and understand what their personal brand is, A, and B, to try and proliferate that personal brand so that they benefit, the club benefits, and there's a win-win environment. With that in mind, I want you to think about this question as well, which is what influences the member and visitor narrative in your club? I've been exposed to a number of different environments, clubs in South Africa, that you get this 80-20 principle. You get 20% of the members that seem to speak for 80%, or seemingly so. There's this perception that 20%, the loudest in the environment, speak for 80%, when actually that's not really the case. And what I mean by that is that those loud or verbose 20% seem to create the perception that everyone follows their sentiment or follows their. Just by show of hands, is anyone challenged with that reality in your space, where 20% of the members ultimately perceivably speak for 80% of the ecosystem? I think most of us, if your camera's not on, you're probably nodding your head, or at least I'm going to assume that you are. But the reality is, ladies and gents, is that we're playing this game of perception, and we're playing this game of narrative. And really, one of the excellent traits that I've seen in the progressive general managers and CEOs of our time today are those who take control of that narrative, who try and shape that narrative as best possible. Again, one of the best ways to do that is actually to go to the core and start to build the personal brands within your club so that they help you to shape that narrative. I hope that makes sense, because you can't do this by yourself. You can't shape the narrative of your entire club by yourself. It's impossible. I can see those who've got more gray hairs just like me, or losing a bit of hair, or something in between, are those who try to shape too much of it themselves. We can't take on all of that by ourselves. So that was a dig at me as much as it was a dig at anyone else. And just bear that in mind. A little bit of self-deprecation to start this morning. Ladies and gents, one of the things that we also must always remember is that in building a brand, it's very different to building a product. When you're building a product that comes out of a factory, when you're building a brand that's made in the hearts and minds of the people that you're trying to create, you're trying to speak to. And there's a fundamental difference between that, because on the one hand, it's ones and zeros. On the other hand, it's, again, as I said, this game of perception, this game of what do I believe, what do I feel. So with that sort of setting the tone, and with that, in your minds to sort of start to percolate, there are four key areas that we're going to look at today that really kind of, I suppose, comprise the brand building process, or the personal brand building process. Those are your origin story. Secondly, your environment or your community. Thirdly, your defining attributes, and then fourthly, your purposeful problem. Now, we're going to do this exercise internally today with you, but I'd like you to think about taking this back into your club and actually doing it with your team, so that it becomes of value to your entire ecosystem as we try and create as much value as possible. So as you think, we're going to start with the origin story, and this is a fascinating little discovery process into what makes us who we are, what makes us different. And as I look at the room this morning, I can see quite a few different individuals that I've gotten to know over the last couple of years, and some that I know less. But the important thing about our origin story is that really what it is it's our cultural capital. It's the capital that we develop that is aligned to things like where were we born, what was our formative education like, what does the context of our family look like, what friends did we have in our formative years, and what is that, and how's that shaped us? And really all of these things, and there are a number of other things as well that have shaped us into where we are today. But that origin story, if I take you into Hollywood for a second, is something that even the filmmakers use to build up context and rapport and understanding. I'm sure a lot of you enjoyed the movie Top Gun, or now 2 movies of Top Gun over your time. And if you look at the protagonist that was Maverick, one of the interesting developments as a character for him was his origin story. Now, I don't know how many of you watched the first Top Gun, but I'm going to assume at least 50% of us have taken the time to invest and indulge in a bit of Top Gun. I know Piers watched it 64 times. David, I think, is only up to 18. So, we've got different levels of understanding. But one of the things that we do remember about Top Gun is the fact that at the origin, at the start of it, was an individual who was fighting against the legacy of his father, someone who was a maverick in his own right, who was framed for something he didn't really do, and the narrative around that was quite negative. So he had this chip on his shoulder as he develops his character through the movie. Slightly closer to home and slightly more real, the origin story of Elon Musk. And for those of you who haven't read his book by Daniel Isaacson, I strongly recommend that you do, is the reality of someone who grew up in a very challenging South African environment where bullying and aggressiveness was at the root cause of his initial character development. And if you see his behavior today, a lot of his erratic behavior is a function of that volatility that he experienced as a young individual. So a lot of his problem-solving mentality was also a function of that. And again, I encourage you to read that book to get you to understand that. But our origin story, ladies and gents, whether it's us or a member of our team, is a vitally important part of what shapes our personal brand. And part of the discovery of your personal brand is understanding what that origin story is all about. So we're gonna do a little exercise this morning to start the interactive part of this. And what I'm going to ask you to do is 3 simple things. I'm going to ask you to think about 3 elements of your personal story, of your origin story rather, right? 2 of those things I'd like to be true, things that really did happen to you, or an environment that you did have as reality in your space. The 3rd thing I'm going to ask you to create is a fictitious thing, something which is false. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask a few people this morning, I'm going to ask you to mention those 3 things. And as the person is mentioning those 3 things, I'm going to ask you in your individual capacity to try and identify the item that is false. So if I ask Alison to think for me of the 3 things that form part of her origin story, as you're listening to her story, I'm going to ask you to identify for me which one of the 3 is the false one that she has identified. So we're gonna go around the room a little bit, and we're gonna see what's the difference. And I want you to try and listen to the difference in the stories, the difference in the items that come out of this this little exercise this morning. I'm gonna give you a moment or 2 just to think about what those 3 things are. I'm sure some of you've got them on the tip of your tongue. Perhaps others might take a little bit longer to come to that refined number of things. Pam, I'm sure, has got about 5 or 6 already. Ladies and gents, I'm going to assume that if your camera is off, that you are still then able to answer. As Charles mentioned, it is easier for me to see your face, but I'm going to make the assumption that you are able to answer for me. We are going to kick off this morning with Crystal. Crystal, how are you doing this morning?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
You look so excited to start us off. Thank you for that wonderful smile this morning. So as we kick off, in any particular order, I'm going to ask you to use your most devious poker face to not give anything away. But as you mention your 3 things, ladies and gents, try and understand which one, or identify rather, which one of the 3 you think is the false. So without further ado, Crystal, give us your 3.
Okay, my 3 things is: number 1, I started working full-time when I was 15 years old. Number 2, I didn't finish school or college. And then number 3, I moved out of home and was fully self-dependent at 21 years old.
Okay, so just quickly to repeat those for anyone who didn't hear it.
So number one, started working full-time when I was 15 years old. Number two, I didn't finish school or college. And then number three, I moved out of home and was fully dependent at 21 years old.
Super, thank you. So just quickly, ladies and gents, try and think which one of those, is it 1, 2, or 3, which is the false item out of the 3. I do apologize, my Who Wants to Be a Millionaire backing track isn't working at the moment, so the suspense isn't created at this stage, but just imagine there's suspenseful music in the background as you contemplate your answer. And we get to Crystal's answer, which is 1, 2, or 3. Crystal, which is the one that is false?
I see a few people in the chat got it right. Number 2 is false.
Number 2 is false. Just to remind us, number 2 being?
I didn't finish school or college.
Okay, all right. Before we move on to the next candidate, just quickly, and I'm not asking each person before we move on to the next person, but Crystal, in terms of those 3 things, which of those 3 things do you think has shaped the personality, the human that you are today, the most out of the ones that you identified?
I think they're all integrated to quite a important part of my growth and my personality development. I think the hardest one was being out of school and out of the normal way of society at 15 years old and working full-time as a chef. And those that have F&B experience knows that the chef world is very difficult. But I'm very proud of the person I am today, and I could only thank my past experiences for that.
Fantastic. I suppose the difficult ones, especially a kitchen being a very unvolatile place, is a great place to learn, right? For those of you who don't know, a kitchen is certainly not an unvolatile place. So there are some interesting chefs and head chefs out there that will shape us quite interestingly. I'm sure Crystal can give us some examples and some stories to that effect. Moving on to Cassie. Cassie, good morning. How are you, sir?
All right, just had to unmute me. Very well yourself, Rob.
Yeah, good, thank you. Good, thank you, Cassie.
Number 1, single parent upbringing from the age of 10. And then being an extrovert. And then number 3 is a people's pleaser.
Right. So single parent upbringing, extrovert, and people's pleaser. Again, ladies and gents, think if you know Cassie well, you might know the answer better than others. If you don't, take a guess. Maybe he's given it away in his way that he's brought it across. Maybe not. Right, a couple of people saying number 2. Pam saying people pleaser. Right, Cassie, take away our suspense.
I'm definitely not an extrovert. Single parent upbringing, yeah, from the age of 10 when my father passed away. And I think that also shaped me into being a people's pleaser. And I always try and please people. So, and then I'm definitely not an extrovert. My background is account, so that says all.
Cassie, give us some insight into, there are a lot of us, I think, who have to, whether we want to or not, we become people pleasers in this space. What is it like trying to be a people's pleaser, but at the same time not being an extrovert, as you said, sort of being more introverted? How do you find the challenge between those two dynamics?
It is very difficult, in the industry that we are, we customer service orientated. So, and that can be mentally draining for an introvert like myself. So day to day is quite a challenge. So it's quite difficult being in the situation that you find yourself as being in management. It's easier working with a team, but those external factors of dealing with memberships with different personalities, it is rather draining, I must admit.
Very, very interesting, Cassia. It's often introverts we find ourselves taking strength from the time that we spend by ourselves in solitude. That's the time that we kind of recharge. And very often in this environment, you have to be in spaces where you're either motivating someone else, you're answering to a member, and all the things in between. So an interesting insight there, and we can unpack that further. But thank you very much. Thank you. Let's go to Pam. Good morning, Pam. How's Kloof doing? Very keen to hear your three this morning.
Good morning, everybody. To start off with, I had a very close relationship with my parents. That sort of grounded me from the beginning. And then I only went to school to play sport, nothing else. And I loved going to drama school. That was my favorite part of my youth.
Right. So close relation with your parents, only went to school for sports. Is that right? And drama being a big part of your youth.
Yes.
Right. Very keen to see which one this one is. I think Liam's got it down. He looks like he's ready to give the answer. Charles, I think he's in two minds, but he's putting on a brave face. Jessica, I think you might have it. Maybe not. Maureen saying number one, maybe. Jessica sticking to number one as well. Cassie going for number two. Pam, you must be a good poker player because I don't think this is an obvious one.
No, number three. I couldn't bear drama and I couldn't get up in, as you must realize, I really do not like being in front of people, talking in front of people. So that was really a challenge for me. And still is, so yeah.
Okay. The irony being is that, sorry, carry on.
Started off in this industry being very meek and mild and quietly sit in the corner, but obviously you decide one day, well, you can't get anywhere having that sort of mentality or disposition. So yeah, it's taken a lot to be able to do what I do today, I must say. Yeah, and it's the industry that's helped me in all the different aspects. Yeah,
it's fascinating that you see it like that, because in the very same token, one might see it as a burden rather than a blessing, in the sense of how it has shaped you. You see it as an opportunity to develop yourself. Is that a conscious decision that you've made? Is that something which you've always felt, or is that something that you've come to realize with time?
A conscious decision, yeah, and helped me over time, I must say. Yes.
Okay, interesting. Let's do one or two more. Let's go to Dave this morning. Good morning, Dave. How's things at Westlake?
Rob, all good, thank you.
Good.
Okay,
you look hesitant to give us your three.
No, I'm fine.
Right. My
staff all sitting in after me. First one, safe, happy upbringing. I had a good upbringing. Second one, I had very few friends. And the third one, I was allowed to be myself by my parents.
Right. Thank you for sharing those. Okay, so safe and happy upbringing, few friends, and allowed to be yourself by your parents. I think that's more or less what it was, I hope, if I got it correctly.
Yeah.
Which one out of the three? Cassie says number three. Rensha, what do you think? Francois, any guesses? Grant, what's your guess? Jessica saying number three. Dave, what's the one we're looking for?
Okay, so I had loads of friends. I had a wonderful upbringing, and they did include a lot of friends. So yeah, I had an actually very, very cool life, and that was one of the things that actually shaped me, was how many friends I had and how good they were to me, and vice versa. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm kind of glad that was the one that wasn't. But nonetheless, what you said that shaped you. Has it always been something important to you to have a community of people around you that essentially you could trust in and see eye to eye with?
Yes, it has. Having a happy life, obviously, and your parents allowing you to be yourself allows you to be yourself out there as well. I think maybe I attracted people, and people that were friendly were attracted to me, and vice versa. And I think that's carried on in my job and possibly in my professional life as well. I know down here, all the managers, we're all great friends as well. And I think that has shaped me in the last 7 years in the Western Cape too. So yeah, friendship and people around me are very important to me. Yeah.
Isn't it interesting how even in this room we have someone in your capacity who takes energy and strength from that community of people around you that you call your friends, and then in some of our cases we are more introverted, where we take energy from solitude and being by ourselves.
Absolutely.
And the interesting thing, Cass, and I'm referring to you, in some cases I have introverted tendencies, I think other people here as well, is the fact, ladies and gents, that in that difference is one of the strengths of being a great manager and leader, is the fact that we understand that in different people that we manage and lead, and what they need to recharge. You know, we're in a game where you need to be recharged as often as possible because of the amount of challenge that we deal with from various members, visitors, etc. So to know what that recharge point or dynamic is for our staff is so important. An open question to everyone is, how many of your members do you think know that origin story that some of you have elaborated on today? How many of the members actually know your origin story, know your staff's origin story? And more importantly, when you've listened to people this morning and them giving their origin story, has your view on that person changed at all after listening to what they've given us this morning? I'd love to go through everyone, but for obvious reasons, we can't go through everyone. But I want to ask you, for the people that you have listened to this morning, if anyone would like to unmute themselves and tell me, how is you, and you don't have to mention any in particular individual, but having heard their story just a little bit, do you feel closer to that? Do you feel like you understand that person a bit better? Do you feel like you can relate to them a bit better? Anyone would like to share their feeling on that? Does it feel like you come a little bit closer to that particular person, Jessica?
Sorry, I definitely think that you learn there's connection between all of us, regardless of our cultures or backgrounds, and hearing everyone's stories. There's always something that you can relate to and build a bond. So definitely. Awesome.
Yeah, well said. And thank you for sharing that. I think that's something that I find is the case in most of these interventions where we do something. So the reason why I'm bringing this up, ladies and gents, is that very often a member, a visitor, whoever, might come down quite heavily on one of us or one of our staff. And one of the things that we've learned is that when there is a certain degree of connection with someone, the inclination to want to come down heavily on another human being is significantly diminished when you actually understand a bit of context around where they come from. So I think a lot of us are trying to mitigate the degree of volatility, if I can put it that way, that lives within certain members that we look after. Is that fair to say, Carmen? That there's some members that so often don't think twice about, you know, telling us how it is and you know, what they feel and all of these things. Is that fair to say? Is that something which a lot of us share in this room this morning?
Definitely, I suggest. I will definitely agree with that.
Okay. And with this in mind, a way to shape the narrative, ladies and gents, is to find clever and interesting ways to share these origin stories with our environment. So, for example, I'll give you a quick sort of case study, a very brief one of what we did with the club about 4 or 5 years ago. We had a number of members who were being incredibly antagonistic to the food and beverage team. Some of the complaints were justified, but the manner in which it was happening was just, you know, very derogatory, and it wasn't serving any real purpose. So what we actually started to do was we started to interview some of the front of house and back of house staff, literally asking them exactly what I've just asked you today. We put them behind a camera, and it wasn't a fancy big rig. It was just, we got a pretty good iPhone, or I can't remember what it was at the time, a Canon or something, and we filmed their story. And what we started doing is, in the communication that went out to the members and visitors, we what were the enjoyable things that you had growing up, right? And what was fascinating to start seeing, and not in complete majority, but significantly better, was that the members, the degree of complaints, and rather the way that they brought across the dissatisfaction, was a lot more mitigated and a lot more composed. So what I guess I'm trying to say to each and every one of us is, let's start to tap into these origin stories, perhaps in a little bit more depth, and share those stories. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, geez, there's some members that won't change them. That won't affect how they come across. You'll be surprised with some of these members, the version that you see of that person when they're in their environment with people that they're connected with. They're often a very different version of the person. So I want to encourage you to elicit these origin stories, not just understanding them in your capacity of how you wired, but actually understanding them in the case of the team that you manage on a day-to-day basis. So another great internal intervention that I would encourage you to do is this. It's a half-an-hour exercise with a group of staff. And what I'd encourage you to do is the following. Get some staff from food and beverage, get some staff from golf operations, get some staff from reception or admin, get some staff from finance or marketing or whichever departments you have. And in the space of half an hour, get them to share their origin story with the people that they work with. Right? Because what that actually does is it starts to solidify the bonds between the humans that represent your company, your brand, your club. And by doing that, the degree of friction and the nature in which we disagree starts to become a lot more humanistic. It mustn't be a long exercise. It must be something which they find interesting, something where they learn about the fellow people that they work with. It's important to have a cross-departmental exercise. So it's not just with the people that they spend most of the day with, it's with the human beings which they don't often spend a lot of time with. How often does a starter engage with a waiter in your club, right? How often does the receptionist engage with the course marshal in your club? And for them to start learning those origin stories is ultimately how we start to develop the individual or the personal brands within that space. Pierre, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, Rob.
So it's interesting because depending on where you work, and it depends how connected you are to our teams, we see these natural bonds being created. And in some cases, those form organically. And in some cases, we need to engineer those. But regardless, what is interesting about how we listen and how we connect to a story is three things. There's three things that typically, depending on how we are wired as people, that we connect to. And those are either facts, feelings, or fun, right? So when you're delivering a message, you either take value in fact, feelings, or fun. And however you message or bring across something, it's always important, whether you're telling your origin story, whether you're encouraging someone else to tell or communicate who they are, try and always incorporate those three elements into what you're doing. So I'm going to give you an example of that by looking at a remarkable South African, which you probably haven't heard of before, but his name is Tulani, and he's done something rather incredible from a very, very low base. I want you to think about those three words, facts, feelings, and fun, as you watch this little clip about Tulani.
Human dignity is one of the most important things. And once you start compromising it, you're never gonna be strong on whatever ground you're standing in. I was born and bred in Kliptown in a one-room shack with about 7 other siblings and my mom. I felt it was important for me to go to school because when you come from a family where there's no success background, it's always very challenging to believe that you can succeed. And I wanted to be that example within the community. People out there have lost hope and they just need to be reminded that they're still powerful and they can still achieve whatever they want to achieve. I felt that it was very important for me to be able to guide others.
Are you kidding me? How's it, brother? I'm good, thanks, Andy. Cool, my man.
Your success is your community's success. Placing those 23 young people into university and college, it was a huge achievement because should those young people succeed, then they will always know that they need to go back and help others that are still going through the same challenges that they went through.
What I need is something that where you looking up. It was just about you looking up, moving up to the sky. That's it.
There are many opportunities for us as the youth of today to break all the barriers that have been there. We don't see what our parents used to see. So the opportunity that is there is for us to educate our parents that human beings are equal all over the world because we all have same blood and same soul. Yeah, we're going top of the roof, going to do some Gambu dance.
Looking more forward and up. That's it.
What's really gonna make me feel happy is to see every South African child being able to go to school free and compulsory. Unequal people should never demand equality.
Him jumping, facing up, just rising out of his circumstances. It doesn't matter what situation you're in. With education and doing what you love, you can achieve anything, and that's what the portrait stands for.
The portrait is very nice. We're living in the world of possibilities. We can be whatever we want to be. It's always about the attitude that you take whenever you approach something. I always advise young people not to limit themselves and make sure that we continue to make South Africa a better country.
So Tulani is part of a very interesting program called the 21 Icons, and it's showcasing a number of South Africans that, again, we haven't often heard of, but are doing remarkable things in their respective communities. I wanted to ask you very quickly, as you watch that little insight into Tulani's story, what are some of the emotions or some of the feelings that you gather as you listen and you perceive an individual like that? Carmen, if I can ask you, what strikes you about him as a human being, as an origin story?
For me, I got the feeling that he wanted more for his community, not just for himself, and then that he worked harder to create that for his community and not just for himself.
Absolutely, yeah, well said. Grant, if you look at his origin story, how is his origin, his beginning shaped what he's doing today? I'm not sure if Grant is with us. Let's go to Letitia. Letitia, what do you think? How do you think his origin story has shaped what he's focusing on doing today?
Obviously, he's where he started out, he wants to obviously make sure that there's more that he can contribute back to and have more youngsters following his footsteps. So he's just trying to make a difference. So in essence, I would think he's probably found his purpose in life.
Right. And how often, ladies and just well said, Letitia, how often do we find the core reason why someone is doing what they're doing is because of a deficit that existed historically, right? Whatever the deficit is that has existed prehistorically is something that we tend to try and focus on. And that's often why you find that someone who was, for example, growing up in a single home focuses very hard on creating a happy home when they get to that point, or sometimes vice versa. So we try and eliminate the deficits that we faced at a younger period, and that shapes our personal brand. If you haven't realized it already, ladies and gents, this exercise of personal branding is not just this is who I am. It is a process of self-discovery. And that's why it's so important to go back and understand the context of ourselves as well as the people we manage to truly understand how people are wired. So an important thing, if you look at those three words there, facts, feeling, and fun, in terms of the facts, he's addressing the real challenge of inequality. That's a fact, that it's a reality of what it is. Addressing that makes that a compelling story. The feelings around it, he uses his underdog situation to build goodwill. It is a sort of a rags to riches story in a way, in a sense, and that's always going to be a motive for us. And then the fun element, that fun-loving side, the dancing, all of those criteria that kind of add to the substance of the story. So in whatever our messaging is about ourselves, about our environment, or what we're doing, always try and use those three words: facts, feelings, and fun, because if we combine those, we tend to speak to the needs and wants of as many people as possible. A little tactic I want to suggest to you off the back of our first out of the 4, which is our origin story, is to afford staff the time and the opportunity to tell their origin story, as I mentioned earlier. Record those stories. Give the opportunity for people to express their origin story. It's not just about us learning about the origin story. It's the power to express oneself in that way. It's a very liberating and it's a very empowering opportunity to do that. In one case, we had a staff member who was based in Malawi. We recorded her story and we sent it, and we gave her a copy on WhatsApp, and she sent it back to her family. And her family had never understood where she worked. She didn't understand the environment. And by being able to send that back to her, her family gained an understanding of what this environment is that she works in. And that was an incredibly proud moment for her. So tapping into these opportunities, ladies and gents, elicits a version of the human being that sometimes we haven't just seen yet. So before we move on, I want to just reiterate that quote again. Remember that members and visitors don't connect with the club. They don't connect with the walls and the greens and the carpets. They connect with the personalities that represent the club. The more we can bring those personalities out, the better chance we have of creating that connection that potentially lives between us and the people that we serve. Number 2 for today is our understanding of our community, our environment. And this is incredibly important, ladies and gents, for us to build our personal brand. For the primary reason of this, that personal branding is not about you, it's not about me. It's about putting the stamp on the value that we deliver to others. And that's the misnomer about personal branding. A lot of people think when you say personal branding, you think, how do I grow my number of followers? How do I grow my number of people that believe in me? Well, that's possibly just the result. It's the end result. It's far in the distance. It's the input that's the most important. And ultimately what that is it's delivering the value to others to start with. Remember the difference between product and brands. The brands element is how we create that feeling, that perception in the mind of others. That is ultimately what grows our personal brand. So for those of you who like a bit of reading and a little bit of extra study, there's a fantastic article in the Harvard Business Review around building your personal brand. And I'm going to take out a few points out of this article, which really kind of speak to the concept of building a personal brand. And one of the things which is so prevalent in this article is the understanding that we are the sum of our touch points. And what that simply means is that if you think about the number of people out there that perceive our personal brand, there is an opinion being formed almost every day on who we are, what we stand for, what our contributing factors are, etc. So what I mean in literal terms is every single telephone conversation, every single email that we send, every in-person conversation that we and our teams have contributes to the perception of our personal brand. And because this happens every single day, Jessica, because this happens every single day, Tina, we forget the importance of every single one of these interactions. So I really want you to think about that in the concept of your club and what is coming out of your environment. What is the quality of those individual bits of communication or interactions that you're having? And again, how do we influence those in the best possible way? Because what is interesting that comes out of this article as well is an interesting concept called karmic equity. And what karmic equity is, and I want you to think about a bank account, right? So the more deposits you make into the bank account without making a withdrawal, the more that compound interest works for you, right? Fair enough concept. The more that we withdraw, the less compound interest works for us. And this is the karmic notion of doing things for others without the expectation of something in return. Now, the people we tend to disassociate with, the people that we tend to find skeptical are those people that are very often doing something with the well-knowing or intention that they want something in return, right? There's that quite rather pessimistic saying that there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? But the reality is that if the more we do without the expectation of something in return, the more chance we have of building this compounded karmic equity that ultimately builds our brand in the long term. One of the things I really encourage you to try and think about today, very consciously, is the fact that building a personal brand is not a finite game. It's not a game where there's a project, a start, a middle, and an end. It's an infinite game. It is ongoing, and therefore, the more brand affinity you can build over time, the better for your brand, the better for your club. So someone who just was an absolutely brilliant exponent of this idea of karmic equity was a gentleman by the name of Nkosi. And this you would have possibly heard of a couple of years ago. He was the gentleman who used to work for Shell. And what he did was a lady arrived at his Shell garage, was filling up with petrol. And as the pump was filling up, she realized that she'd forgotten her wallet at home. She didn't have the money to pay for the petrol. So what this gentleman did out of his own was he forked out the 300 or 400 rand, I think it was, and he paid for the petrol. Now, for a petrol attendant, that's a lot of money, right? He paid for the petrol without any expectation of that money coming back. The best part of the story was what happened afterwards. Because guess what Monet did, the lady who he helped out, as a result of that. Now, we all know that this gentleman had no idea that this was going to happen. He did that with no expectation of any kind of return. She started a crowdfunding exercise to raise money for this guy. It went viral, and to date, they've raised millions of rands for this person's education. Millions. He has now got a bursary. He's got funding to actually develop himself. So the reason why this stuck with me, and I thought with my pessimistic hat on, was this the first time that Nkosi did this? My guess is no. My guess is that this is the way that he's wired, and his karmic equity, right? The effort that he's put in over time eventually resulted in this kind of goodwill, this kind of thing coming back. But he doesn't do it with the expectation of something in return. So ladies and gents, bringing this back into our space, bringing this back into our environment is to say, how do we make these deposits, right, without the need for a return on a more ongoing basis? How do we give more of our time to teach a subordinate something that will help them? How do we create more win-win situations with our suppliers, right? How do we focus on connecting members that would serve their needs rather than ours? Because ultimately, the more of these things that we do, the more that our personal brand, in the long run, infinitely starts to build up. So an interesting concept that a lot of us deal with, for example, is tips, right? So the idea that some of your staff will go to some members and give them better treatment because they know they tip better. Does anyone deal with that challenge? And if you're not putting your hand up, I know you're talking slight nonsense, because almost in every environment, we see the individual that when that member arrives, that if whoever it might be in whatever position they are, on that person like white on rice. I get it. It's an understanding of the benefit that's going to come off the back of doing that work. What we've got to get mentality-wise into our teams is that is a short-term mentality. And that mentality only works in the short term. It doesn't help us to build brands in the long term and ultimately earn a salary and earn what we're worth in terms of our personal brand. So just a few more points on this article that really is interesting about what they speak on. And one of the items which I found fascinating is this concept of creating brand awareness. So the old school way of creating brand awareness was that you make something, or you try and make something for everyone. You tell your story, you try and attract customers, and you, off the back of that, try and build brand awareness. Now, one of the companies that have fallen foul of this is DStv. Now, if you think about DStv at the moment, they are losing customers hand over fist. Why? Because they try to make something for everyone. They try to tell the story of what it is. They try and attract customers, but the reality is that they've missed one of the most important things. And this is what the progressive environments are now doing, which is to say the new rules of brand awareness are understand the customer's story, right? Understand their context. Now, this is a completely new dimension, because when you start to understand someone else's context, you start to understand what they really want, right? Not the fact that they're complaining about the price of the chicken mayo sandwich, but what it is that they actually want. What is at the principle level the most important? And when you understand that, then you can give them a story to tell about you, because you have found the way to solve for that problem. And by doing that, you create something called brand affinity. Brand affinity is entirely different to brand awareness. And I'll explain to you in a second what the difference is. But if you look at the companies like Formula One, if you look at the NFL, for example, what these environments have done is they have gone to the root cause of what people really want. And in this space today, people want customization. They don't want the big package where half the thing is things they don't watch. They want that specific item that they're paying for, that they love, that they are passionate about. And therefore, they are gaining direct customers to their brand as a result of creating a forum where people can subscribe directly to the sport that they like. And what this means ultimately, and what the value is in for us, is if you start to create brand affinity by getting people to tell your story for you, right? Then you start to create the actions that come off that. Because ultimately, the difference between the two is that in the latter, you're more likely to get the result of behavior. In other words, people rejoining the club or re-signing for the next year. So what this looks like in the context of the club is the following. Just to bring it back into our space, I'm going to use the example of memberships, right? So our membership options, our membership structures. First and foremost is understanding the lifestyle of our future members at Club X, right? What is the nature, what is the context of our club member look like today and in the future? Because understanding that context gives us the ability to find the gaps and the opportunities of where our value proposition fits into that lifestyle. Therefore, curating our membership packages around the gaps that exist today, not yesterday, not the reason why 10 years ago people joined a club, but for today. Thirdly, enabling the member to brag about that club's progressive membership policy to other members. Don't we love as customers to tell our friends about a fantastic deal of a wonderful opportunity that we stumbled upon and almost sing the praises for that brand? I bet you some of you have done that quite recently, something that you've invested in, something you found was really a good deal, and you shared that with someone else, right? You were creating the affinity for that brand. And that's where this trick of the difference today comes, is creating that sense of club affinity as a result of that. So what I encourage you to do, both for our personal brands, but for the brand of the club as well, is let's run to that root, that origin story of our members in more detail. Let's try and understand them. Run a few focus groups if you want to. Go try things that you haven't tried before, but try and understand the context of the environment. Because if you create your options around that truth, you've got far better chance of getting sign-ons and getting that stickiness and that retention. People don't want to pay 1,000 Rand anymore for 60 channels that they're not investing in, right? People don't want to pay X amount of money per year if they are not playing those number of rounds, or if there's a likelihood they're not going to play those number of rounds. I hope that makes sense, because the time is now to reinvent our value proposition. And there are going to be some people in your committees, there are going to be some people that say, look, it's worked for the last 30 years, it's still going to work. Just mention these examples, ladies and gents, because they're going to be a whole lot more. Kodak, Nokia, right? The list is endless of companies that thought that just because what they did yesterday worked, and therefore it's going to work tomorrow. And the reality is that they didn't. So how do we enable and how do we allow, talking about our environments, how do we allow perception to work for us? And when I say perception, one of the biggest challenges that you face, ladies and gents, in your customer journey, in your value proposition, is the fact that you've got so many different touch points. When I tell people who don't understand about golf clubs, about how many things live in a golf club, food and beverage, golf operations, course, finance, marketing, reception, admin, housekeeping, all of these different things, they think, how on earth did these guys get it right? So a lot of our success comes through perception and creating the impression that what we're doing is consistent across the board. So I'm going to give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. If any of you haven't ever read a book called Alchemy. The book is called Alchemy by Rory Sutherland. I strongly recommend you read that book. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a second, but here's a simple example. Just imagine that in your club, every single call that came into your club was answered in 3 rings, right? And for that matter, every single email that was sent to your club was answered within 30 minutes. What does that do to the perception of your environment? Now, I know there's member perception that is existing with other degrees of familiarity, but think about anyone who's phoning in for an inquiry around a golf day. Think about anyone who's maybe a visitor who's thinking of playing your club. And this is something around the narrative that I heard from someone the other day. The guys at ClubX are really on top of things. Their waiters seem to have also picked up on their game. Now, the funny thing was that this person had played this club, I think, twice or 3 times. That's it. And all of a sudden, because the phone was answered promptly, they were making the assumption that everything else was working really well. Have you ever noticed that if you walk into a restaurant and you walk into the bathrooms and the bathrooms don't look that great, what's your first assumption about the kitchen? When you walk into the bathrooms and the bathrooms aren't great, what's your first, Liam, assumption about the kitchen?
So I think, unfortunately, all of us have experienced going to a half-decent restaurant and then asking to go to the loo, and then being guided to outside around the back of the kitchen to the bathroom. So fully agree there. You suddenly really start double thinking on what you're going to order, what's the easiest to make, and probably what's the safest option.
100%. You start questioning how they're making the food. What kind of oil are they using, right? Your mind starts working as to, are they actually doing things properly? And this is the power of perception, ladies and gents, both for our personal brands and for the brand that lives collectively, the sum of our personal brands. So what I'm saying to you as a clever hack, a clever tactic within your space is the following, is identify the initial touch points which create the biggest perception in your club, and work as hard as you possibly can to make those touch points as consistent as you can. A company we've done quite a lot of work with historically is Nespresso, and they are brilliant at the first 30 seconds that you're in their stores, because the first 30 seconds dictate your impression of that brand more than anything else. So the converse of that is, if we start to get this inconsistent reality, the narrative starts working in the members' minds, the narrative starts working in the visitors' minds, and we often defer to a negative rather than the assumption of the positive. So control the narrative as best you can, and let's see what ultimately comes of that 80-20 principle and how we start to control that in a little bit more detail. So as we move on, ladies and gents, to our third one, remember this, personal branding is not about us. It's about putting the stamp on the value that we deliver to our environment, to our community. Try and control that narrative as best as you can, with focusing on value that is relevant to today, and you're going to find a far better degree of retention, a far better degree of conversion as well. Moving on to number 3 very quickly, which is what we call our defining attributes. A question that I'd like to pose to you right now is the following. Think of a personal brand out there that you, in your individual capacity, admire. Think about someone out there that you've always looked up to as a great personal brand. Try and think of someone, if you can, an individual, someone who maybe is a mentor to you, someone who is a figurehead of sorts, someone who you've relied on, someone who you seek their counsel quite often, or even someone who you haven't met before, but you like how they are wired and what they stand for. Tina, anyone come to mind? Pierre, your check is in the mail. Thank you very much.
Well, it's someone close to home. It's my dad. So I think I get a lot of my work ethic from him, and my mom as well. So I've looked up to him. Yeah. And he's always been there, always been reliable, very consistent. So that's who I admire.
It's so often, and it's such a great feather in the cap of your old man that's your answer. And I think it's certainly one of my ambitions with my 2 young daughters one day is to have that answer given from them, So thank you, Tina. I think I haven't met your old man, but I'm sure he'd be very happy to hear that. Pierre, your real figurehead, please. Who would that be?
I guess, Rob, yeah, within the industry at the moment, you know, there's quite a few guys that you look up to that you think it's got it all figured out. You look at Paul Leishman. I think he's unbelievable. He's somebody that I like to have a chat with and grab a coffee with when I get the chance. And Jeff Claus and Louis Destrue. There's quite a few guys that you look up and that you can take things from, that makes day to day a little bit easier. I think growing up, I was lucky. I had quite a few people I could look up to growing up. My grandfather I was really close with growing up. He was incredible, and my parents never pushed me to do anything, but not that they weren't involved, but they were just not that type of parents. But my granddad was really involved with me from a young age, and always had the sort of thing to prove myself to him. Growing up, and I think that's helped me today to where I am, because I've still got the chip on my shoulder, I guess. So quite a few, I guess. And Rob Arnold.
As I said, check in the mail, but let's leave that for another day. Alison, who's the person that you look up to at the moment? Is there one that stands out, or are there a couple?
A couple, just randomly. Brent Lindeque, who's been MC at a couple of CMASA conferences. I mean, I think if you just wake up and read his message every morning, it is quite a good way to start the day. He deserves a medal. Yeah. And I've forgotten his first name, but Suleiman, Gift of the Givers. I mean, what a man.
Yeah.
Just unbelievable. Yeah, what he does, that we could all strive to do something like that. Sure.
Fantastic. Some wonderful role models there. I think regardless of the names that you've mentioned, ladies and gents, what typically stands out, and this is trying to draw a common thread through a number of these individuals, is three traits that we generally admire in people, that we try and emulate, and that is a degree of self-confidence, an element of self-awareness, and a degree of vulnerability. And I want to touch on the last one very quickly, because in the environments we find ourselves in, this is one of the most difficult things to tap into. Self-confidence, self-awareness, and particularly our vulnerability. And we can extract this a little bit in a second, but Carl Jung speaks very interestingly about this challenge that we face. And I want some of you mentioned this right in the beginning when you're talking about your origin story, is that what we have are these two versions of ourselves, which is our shadow self, which we find in the private spaces of who we are, when we're not trying to put on a persona, and then we have the public version of who we are. And a lot of us, if you think about what you're like in front of certain members, the version of yourself you are, and then you take that version of yourself that you are when you're with those people that you trust, you feel comfortable with, you can confide in. What is the difference in those two types of individuals? Is there a stark difference in the version of yourself, or is that quite aligned? And very often what we find is our ego tends to regulate that to a certain degree. Now, sometimes what happens is that when those two versions drift too far apart, we find ourselves acting out in certain occasions because there's this complete difference or huge contrast between who we are as natural human beings, who we're meant to be, and what our public persona starts forcing us to be. And I think a lot of us are challenged with this, especially when we have difficult types of members who kind of are catalysts for the public persona version of us. The problem with this, and you see this in Hollywood, funny enough, is that when you spend too much time being someone else, and we call this, in Hollywood, they call it method acting, is people start to become a version of that person. Much like if we spend too much time in our public persona, we start finding ourselves being a version of ourselves that we don't necessarily like, but that's because we're in that persona so much, we find ourselves, because all we're trying to do rather is build up that guard against us, being attacked. So we build this sort of guard against our members, etc. And the way to overcome this, ladies and gents, very, very importantly, is how we tap into our vulnerability. How do we tap into the fact that We don't have to have all the answers. We don't always have to be perfect. Nobody, and I can tell you now from firsthand experience, no progressive CEO today in any environment is forced to have all of the answers. They actually tap into their vulnerability as a way to build connections with their staff, with their teams. And through that, we actually build a greater bond and a greater connection. So with that in mind, and as I said earlier, our personal brand is a process of self-discovery. I want to try and tap into this vulnerability element today in a sense, and ask you this question, which is, what are some of the shortcomings or weaknesses that you've identified about yourself that really allow you to open up being vulnerable and seeking guidance from others to cover up that blind spot? So what are some of the things that you've identified about you as an individual? And we all have blind spots, ladies and gents. Let's always be upfront about this. None of us are a perfect score. We all have our strengths, and we all have those areas that we need to develop in. So I'm curious to know, across the room very briefly, what are some of the shortcomings or weaknesses that you've identified, that you've verbalized, that are front and center, that you're working on at the moment? So I'm going to ask Maureen to kick us off. Maureen, what is a shortcoming or weakness that you have on your radar as we sit here today?
Sorry, I'm using Bluetooth earphones. Can you hear me?
Vaguely, I can sort of hear.
Okay. So in my situation, I feel I tend to speak too much, and I end up going left instead of right. So I'm working on that. Yeah.
Great. We some irony. So you say you speak too much. You're too much, in the front and center. As a leader, that's a great thing to identify. We'll come back to that in a second. Graham, what's your weakness at the moment? What's your shortcoming that you've identified? I think Graham might be hesitant to give his, or maybe he's stepped out. Francois, can you give me yours this morning? Moving on, Joseph. Charles, we've got a few black marks to give out here, I think. Morne?
Hello, sorry, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yeah, so mine would be probably overcommitting to certain projects.
Right. Yeah. And what effect does that have?
It just makes it there's not enough time in the day to get to all the projects. So instead of doing a quality project, it kind of gets skimmed down because there's too much on the plate then at the end of the day.
Right. Okay. So what's your next step in building towards that, or overcoming that rather?
I would say rather instead of answering on point, maybe just coming back to a client in regards to if it's possible on doing, as opposed to just answering straight away and then having to figure it out afterwards.
Right. That's certainly one avenue. Another one to maybe think about is building the personal brands and therefore the competencies around you to be able to handle some of that, and to develop that skill. So just something to consider. But obviously, depending on our environments, we either have that competency or we have to go and find it somewhere. But thank you for sharing that, Morne. Rob, Mr. Scott, how are you, sir? What's on the top of your list there? Right, moving on. Who else we got? Asked Grant. Liam, what's on the top of your list there, sir?
Yeah, sure, Rob. So I've got two that I've identified more recently. One is say, self-confidence and hesitancy to take action in certain situations, especially if there is quite a conflicting situation, i.e. strong member, etc. Actions on that would probably, just through experience and putting myself through more of those situations, being able to handle them, take it on, dissolve if dissolve needs, or, handle it as needed, and secondly, unfortunately, but fortunately, a yes man. So I say yes as many times as I can to customers and try and make it work, even though sometimes that puts us in vulnerable positions. But I mean, customers happy. So, but I think action on that is just try and understand that saying no is okay sometimes, and to save the experience and save the customer problems, or save myself some problems down the line. But yeah.
Awesome. Liam, thanks for sharing that. And I appreciate that more, because I think that's a challenge which a number of us have faced over time, is that the short-term relief, which is the yes, for the long-term often pain, because meeting all of those expectations becomes very difficult, versus the short-term pain, which is obviously the no, for better things happening on the long term. So I think of it in that sense, ladies and gents, is that there's a lot of strength in a no if it comes from the right place and delivered in the right way. It's not an easy thing to do, but there's a lot of strength that comes off the back of that. Cas, just quickly, your what's top of your list there? I know Cassie's got quite a weak bladder, so he might have had to step out. Let's do one more. Crystal, you look ready to rock, so give me yours very quickly.
I got a few. And I think they're all sort of interlinked with one another. So one of them, I'm very much a perfectionist and I'm very controlling. So I'm very proud of the work I do. So if something doesn't go well or doesn't go according to plan, or I don't feel on top of it, it's a little bit too overbearing. I need to be able to trust my abilities, trust the flow of things, and also be able to let go. And the other side is also caring too much, getting too involved personally, which also ties into taking the pride into your work. So I think of that, I think a lot of it's trusting your vulnerabilities and knowing your strengths, and acknowledging that not everything can always work out the way you want it to. But as long as you have tried your best and you are proud to put your name on it, I think that's a very good thing to keep in mind, and has helped me a lot recently.
Okay. It's interesting how often perfectionists try and take on, a lot themselves to control the controllables, as opposed to letting things out of their control, with others taking ownership of certain things. It's not an easy thing to let go, because it means that the degree that it's fulfilled in or completed with is not necessarily the same degree of quality. But ladies and gents, again, this speaks to the primary purpose of what a great personal brand is, and that's ultimately developing the personal brands that live around us. And all of these vulnerabilities, and a question to all of you, the first question should always be, it's not just about how do you overcome your vulnerabilities, but how do you create an environment around you that compensates for your vulnerabilities, because some of these shortcomings are going to live with us forever, right? If you're a perfectionist, you're probably going to be a perfectionist forever, right? If you are a stickler for, if you're obsessive compulsive, you're probably going to be obsessive compulsive forever. There's not much that's going to change that, right? So it's about how do you create an environment around you with the people around you that make up for your faults. One of the most interesting conversations recently that I've been having with the outside CEOs of the club industry that I work with is, when I ask them about their vulnerabilities, one of the first things that they're saying is, well, I'm developing John, Sally, Simon, Joseph to develop the blind spots that I have in those areas, right? So it's that understanding of how do we compensate for that, not through just developing us, but developing the people around us. An exercise that we do in a sort of physical space, which I encourage you to start thinking about, is we call it, what is your swish, right? What are the traits, what are the elements of your makeup, of your attributes that are defining of your personal brand? And this is something that I encourage you to do with your teams as well, is in developing their personal brand, what are the elements that define that particular individual? So sometimes our strengths and our weaknesses are actually very closely linked, right? Sometimes our greatest strength can also be closely linked to our greatest weakness. But the idea being is what defines you as an individual. And I'm curious, and I'm going to ask one or two people very quickly as we need to move on. But if I had to ask you in a split second, what is the most defining attribute of you as a personal brand? How quickly can you come up with that? So Pam, I'm going to shoot at you very quickly. Few seconds. What's the one attribute that defines you as a personality?
Empathy.
Empathy. Jessica? Just unmute yourself.
Sorry, it wasn't clicking. I think I strive for perfection and excellence here.
Okay, perfection and excellence. Dave?
Accommodating.
Accommodating. Hester, I see there's two of you. Sorry, I'm not sure what the individuals are there, but if you can both give me yours. I don't think I'm muting there. Pierre, very quickly, what's yours?
Oh, sorry. Rob, I'd say confident.
Confident. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Sometimes too confident. Just moving on. Sorry, ladies and gents, if you don't know, I do know Pierre quite well. That was probably a personal joke. But moving on, what's very, very important around this, ladies and gents, not so much just for us, but again, within the environment that we work in, is get people to be conscious of what that trait is. What's interesting when we work with certain brands, what is so simplistic but so powerful is that any single time that they go into a discussion around what the direction is going forward, is they revert back to literally 2 or 3 words that define the brand or the person, and that is the North Star. So always going according to that. So in other words, if you're trying to develop a staff member underneath you, you always go back to, okay, Rob, you said that you are empathic, you are driven, you are proactive. Tell me, how are you living those things today? What did you do this week that allowed you to live those 3 values? Bring them always back to it. It's not an academic exercise, it's a practical one. So try and make it as conscious in their space as you possibly can. And then the last one for today, ladies and gents, is what we call your purposeful problem. And that is, again, what is guiding our personal brands in terms of our day-to-day focus on how we deliver relevancy in our space. And one of the things that we've always got to remember very closely is that, you know, being of value today is simply about this. It's about the relevant problems that we are seeking to solve in our professional space. When we are solving relevant problems, we are by definition of value to the environment that we're looking after. And I always ask the question to people in the club industry, but it's a simple one. And that is, why do you think people join your club? What do you think the fundamental reason is why people join your club? And I'm not saying to play golf or to play paddle or to... That's a surface level answer. The question is, why do people actually join the club? And that's an answer that I encourage you to really think about, because when we unlock that, we get to the real purpose of what we're doing. It might be to create an environment where people can let go of the worries of the current world, where they can escape from that. It might be to make more friends or to be part of a community. But those are the kind of answers, ladies and gents, that if we get into ourselves and into our teams, our focus, our priority becomes more aligned to that rather than the functional value that is inherent there. So, for example, just the one that I created as a simple kind of case is a purposeful problem would be something like to prevent any member or visitor from feeling unvalidated in my space. So, for example, if I'm working as a receptionist, I want to make sure that every single individual that I come into contact with in the day is feeling validated when they're in my space. So the associated behavior, if I know that and I revisit that as my purposeful problem, is that I'm going to be proactive in my greeting. I'm going to answer my calls quicker. I'm going to be more responsive on email. I'm going to enhance my curiosity about people so that I understand the difference between people. So my challenge to you is this: with those positions that create perception in your space, how clear is the purposeful problem that they are trying to solve? And problem is not a bad word here, ladies and gents. Problem is a good thing, because problem means relevancy. So for every single one of our teams, sure, you can have a job description. Sure, you can have KPIs. All those things are flowing from this. But the most important thing you can create for any individual is a purposeful problem. If I've got a starter, right? My purposeful problem as a starter is to make sure that that golfer has everything that they possibly need to feel as comfortable as they are on the first tee, visitor or member, right? If I'm a course marshal, my purposeful problem is to make sure that every single golfer on this golf course is having an experience that they're not being pushed, they're not having to wait, they're feeling relaxed in their space. That's my purposeful problem. If I'm a waiter, I'm making sure that every visitor understands what the value proposition is here, that they feel valued, they feel like they're important. They're not waiting 15 minutes for a cappuccino. So we can go through every position and we can create a purposeful problem for that. And I encourage you to do that exercise. Do that exercise, print it on a card and give it to that person. Laminate it, right? Revisit that purposeful problem on a weekly basis. And it's amazing how our behavior starts to align to that. So ladies and gents, to come to an end of what we're talking about today, when we're talking about these 4 key elements of what personal branding is all about, is I just want to remind you that in creating a great personal brand, there's actually a lot of selflessness that lives in creating a great personal brand. The brands that we love, that we admire, whether it's a Madiba, whether it's an Oprah, whether it's a whatever, are the people, or a Brett Lindeque, sorry, Alison, are the people that have been selfless in their contributions to others, right? They've identified a relevant problem and they've tried to serve others, and in doing so, have ultimately served themselves. Untap those origin stories in your space. Understand that environment, the context of the human being that you are serving as best possible. Be clear on the defining attributes within your team, within yourself. Revisit those as much as you can. And then lastly, never forget your purposeful problem, the reason why you're doing what you're doing. And if we focus on those enough, like anything in life, that identity becomes to solidify, and we can be incredibly proud of that personal brand. Ladies and gents, thank you for listening today. I hope it has been informative. Are there any questions? Charles, I know you've normally got about 4 or 5 that you like to deliver at the end of the seminar, because you've been listening so carefully. Alison, I know, wants to tell us about Brett's latest post, for those of us who didn't see it this morning. Alison, did you not check it? I thought you said you checked it this morning. No, right. David?
I normally do, but no, I haven't looked this morning. Sorry.
But I'm sure you'll look.
At least he is up at 5, so that's a good. He normally posts it at 5. This morning was a bit of things went pear-shaped.
Right. like life normally does, I'm sure.
That's me at the moment.
Okay, no problem. Right, Pam, thank you very much. For those of you who I haven't been able to speak to, I hope that you have been listening. But that's it from me. Charles, back to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was
very
great.
much.
Guys, just a quick reminder, the registration link, I posted it in the chat box again. If you can please complete that. I'm not going to know that you attended this webinar if you don't complete the registration form. I've also put in a feedback form, a link to a feedback form. If you guys can take a minute or 2 to complete that for us. Feedback always very welcome and valuable to us. So please and thank you. And Rob, thank you so much. That was absolutely amazing. Enjoyed it. And thanks guys for joining. We'll see you guys soon.
Absolutely. And Charles, well done on the beard. I'm trying to grow one, but it's not working out so well. But anyway, that's a story for another time. Have a great one, ladies and gents.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
All the best. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.